What if I told you that some of the greatest art in world history exists partly because a bunch of rich bankers wanted to make their city better, impress their rivals, support learning, gain political power, and make sure everybody remembered their name? Now, that might make them sound kind of jerky and self-centered, but I don't really mean it that way because that's one of the strange things about history. People can do things for mixed reasons. They can genuinely love art and learning, and they can also like the fact that everybody knows they're the ones paying for it. They can build a church because they care about God, and they can also put their family name all over the place so no one forgets who wrote the check. You know, the same thing happens today all the time. The next time you travel, you could go to Rockefeller Center in New York, the Getty Center in Los Angeles, or Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. And that brings us to one of the most important families of the Renaissance, a family that definitely would have had a center, a university, or probably half a city named after them if they lived today. The Medici. The Medici were bankers. They were political players. They paid for artists and scholars, and in a way, they became the unofficial power behind the city of Florence, Italy, for generations. They weren't always technically in charge, at least not at first, but they had money, they had connections, they had people who owed them favors, and sometimes that matters more than having your name on a plaque above the door. So, to understand the Renaissance, we really do have to talk about money. Let's dig in. Okay, so in the last couple videos, we've been building this chain of events. The Silk Road helped open Europe's imagination back up. Italian city-states started making money through trade, production, shipping, and business. And one of those cities, Florence, becomes especially important because it turns into one of the great centers of the Renaissance. But for this story, we need to slow down a little and focus on Florence itself, because Florence is kind of interesting. It's not Venice, sitting out there on the water with ships sailing in and out of the Mediterranean. It's not Genoa, fighting for control of sea trade. Florence is inland, along the Arno River, and yet this city becomes one of the places where money, art, politics, learning, and ambition all start coming together in a big way. A big part of that starts with cloth, especially wool. And I know that doesn't sound all that exciting. When you think Renaissance, you probably think Michelangelo painting ceilings, Leonardo sketching flying machines, Botticelli painting Venus floating in a seashell. You probably don't think, ah yes, wool. That's where the magic is. But at the time, wool and textiles were a big deal. Florence was becoming famous for taking raw wool and turning it into high-quality cloth that people across Europe wanted to buy. That means workers had to clean it, dye it, weave it, finish it, and make sure it was good enough to protect the city's reputation. If Florence was going to be known for cloth, they couldn't just throw together something that looked like an amateur sewing project gone wrong. It's hard to sew, you know? And once that kind of business gets going, money starts moving throughout the city in a major way. Merchants are buying raw materials, paying workers, selling finished cloth, making deals, waiting for payments, shipping goods, borrowing money, lending money, trying not to lose everything because a building caught on fire or somebody robbed the merchant's wagon on the way through the mountains. And that's where things start getting a little more complicated. If you're doing business across long distances, you don't want to literally carry bags of coins from one city to another every time you make a deal. That sounds less like smart business and more like an invitation for every thief in the neighborhood to come ruin your day. So you need people who can handle money in smarter ways. You need credit, loans, contracts. You need trusted families with connections in different cities. You need people who understand how to move wealth without physically dragging piles of silver all over Europe. In other words, you need bankers. And that is where the Medici family starts to rise. When we're talking about a spark, if there is one, that helped ignite the Italian Renaissance in Florence, we need to talk specifically about Cosimo de Medici. Cosimo wasn't the first important Medici banker, though. His father, Giovanni de Medici, really helped build up the family banking fortune. But Cosimo is the one who takes that fortune and turns it into a ton of political and cultural power. My students might say he had aura, or is it riz? Who knows? Anyway, the Medici Bank became one of the most important banks in Europe. They handled money for merchants, nobles, and even the papacy. And when you're handling money for the Pope, you're not exactly running a little lemonade stand on the corner. That's big-time banking. Now, Renaissance banking was more complicated than just opening a savings account at the local bank. There were religious rules against charging interest on loans. Wouldn't that be nice if that was the case today? So bankers had to work through the exchange rates, fees, partnerships, bills of exchange, and all kinds of money tricks that could get pretty complicated. After all, they needed to make a profit to stay in business, so they did what they could. But the main idea is pretty simple. They figured out that money could make more money. If you had capital, which basically means money or wealth you can use, you could loan it, invest it, move it, protect it, exchange it, and use it to create even more wealth. And that's a big shift from the older world of the medieval feudal system, where so much power was tied directly to land. In the old Middle Ages, the lord had the land, and because he had the land, he had power. But in this newer city world, a banker could become powerful because he controlled money, credit, and connections. That's a different kind of power, and the Medici were very good at using it. Cosimo de Medici became the man in Florence. Florence was supposed to be a republic, so Cosimo wasn't officially a king, but he definitely had king-like power behind the scenes. If you have the money, if you have the relationships, if people owe you favors, if you can help someone get what they want, then you can shape what happens even if you're not sitting on a throne. That's why I sometimes think of Cosimo almost like the godfather of Florence. If you've ever read The Godfather or watched the movie, you know what I'm getting at. You need a loan? Maybe we can help. You need a church project funded? Maybe we can help. You need a scholar supported? Maybe we can help. You have a political problem? Well, maybe we can help with that too, but don't tell anybody. Now, I don't want to make the Medici sound like cartoon villains or mafia gangsters because that wouldn't really be fair. They did a lot that genuinely helped Florence. They supported art, architecture, scholarship, libraries, churches, and public projects. But I also don't want to pretend that they were just sweet, generous people handing out money because they loved everybody and wanted hugs. They were powerful. They were ambitious, political, and they wanted influence. And again, both things can be true. Sort of reminds you of Julius Caesar and Augustus back in the day, doesn't it? One of the big words here is patronage. A patron is someone who pays for, supports artists, writers, architects, scholars, musicians, and other creative people. And patronage, rich people supporting the arts, is one of the biggest reasons the Renaissance looks the way it does. Because art costs money. Architecture costs money. Books, education, marble, paint, and skilled labor all cost money. If you want a beautiful church, somebody has to pay for it. If you want a sculptor to spend years carving a masterpiece, somebody has to feed that sculptor. If you want scholars to collect, copy, translate, and study ancient books, somebody has to fund that work. So when we look at the Renaissance and say, wow, look at all this beauty and learning, somewhere behind that beauty and learning is usually somebody paying the bill. And in Florence, the Medici family paid a lot of bills. Cosimo supported scholars and helped build libraries. He supported architecture and learning. Later members of the Medici family supported artists whose names are still famous today, like Botticelli, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci. Just to be clear, not every Renaissance genius worked directly for Cosimo personally. The Medici story stretches across generations, and Renaissance Florence was bigger than just one family. There were other patrons, other guilds, other families, other churches, other forces at work. But the Medici were one of the major families helping create that environment. And that environment is what we call the Renaissance. The word Renaissance means rebirth. But what exactly is being reborn? Basically, people are looking back to ancient Greece and Rome. They're studying classical literature, philosophy, architecture, sculpture, government, history, and human achievement. They're reading Cicero. They're thinking about Plato and Aristotle. They're studying the Roman buildings and Greek statues. They're looking at ancient worlds saying, those were the good old days. Let's bring some of that back. That's where we get the idea of humanism, the idea that human beings can do great things and that studying human thoughts, writing, beauty, and accomplishments actually matters. Keep in mind, humanism doesn't mean everybody suddenly stopped believing in God. Not true. Renaissance humanists were often deeply Christian, but what they were doing was paying more attention to people, what humans can create, what humans can understand and build and think about, and what ancient writers were actually had figured out. They weren't necessarily saying forget God, they were saying maybe studying human beings and ancient classics can help us understand the world better. And that helps explain why Renaissance art looks different from a lot of medieval art. In a lot of medieval art, the goal wasn't always to make people look perfectly realistic. A painting might be trying to teach a religious lesson, tell a Bible story, or point people toward God. So if the hands looked a little weird or the faces all looked kind of the same, that wasn't always the main concern. The point was the message. But in the Renaissance, artists became more interested in anatomy, perspective, proportion, emotion, movement in the human body. They still paint religious scenes, absolutely, but the people in those scenes start looking more human, more physical, more emotional, and more alive. And again, that takes money. If you want artists experimenting with perspective, studying anatomy, carving marble, painting chapels, and designing buildings, someone has to support that work. The Medici were all about it. And I think students understand this better if we compare it to something more modern. Think about Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie made a fortune in steel, and then he used a lot of his money to build libraries, Carnegie Hall, schools, and the like. Was that generosity? Yeah, absolutely. Was it also a way to improve his reputation and attach his name to education and culture forever? Also, yes. Both things can be true. And we can even see smaller versions of that in our own communities. Someone makes money in business, oil, banking, manufacturing, some other industry, and then they fund a park, a school, a theater, a library, a hospital, or some public project. Around Dayton, for example, you have Kettering, Ohio, named after Charles F. Kettering, the inventor and businessman connected with the electric starter for cars and the co-founder of Delco. And if you've ever seen Frey's Pavilion in Kettering, that's named after Ermal Frey's, the guy who invented the pull tab opener for beverage cans. That's not exactly the same as the Medici, obviously, but it helps explain the basic idea. Wealth becomes power. Power becomes buildings, art, schools, churches, and that's what we call patronage. And in Florence, patronage helped make the city beautiful. But Florence wasn't just a peaceful art museum where everyone sat around politely discussing Plato and sipping tea. That was a competitive, political, sometimes dangerous city. And there were rival families. There were factions, conspiracies, exiles, power struggles. Sounds like Washington, D.C. in an election year. Renaissance Italy could be brutal and brilliant at the same time. And that's another reason why the Medici are also interesting. They weren't just art lovers, they were survivors in a political world where losing power could mean exile, prison, or death. So when they paid for art or buildings, and they were helping people accept their power. And they were sending a message that they belonged there. They were leaders. They were the ones making Florence great. And guess what? It worked. Florence became one of the great symbols of the Renaissance. But the Medici story doesn't stop with Florence. Some members of the Medici family eventually became popes, and that connects this Renaissance money story to another huge turning point in history, the Protestant Reformation. One of the most famous Medici popes was Pope Leo X. During his time, the church was trying to raise money for massive building projects in Rome, especially St. Peter's Basilica. Indulgences were connected to the church's teaching about reducing punishment for sin. That's a much bigger religious topic, and I'm not going to try to explain the whole thing here. But by Luther's time, the selling and promotion of indulgences had become a major controversy. Martin Luther looked at what was happening and basically said, yeah, I don't think this is right. We need to talk. In 1517, Luther challenged the sale of indulgences, and that helped spark the Protestant Reformation. So think about how connected this whole chain is. Marco Polo and other travelers help Europeans imagine a larger world. The Silk Road and trade routes help move goods, ideas, and technology. Italian cities become wealthy. Florence gets rich through wool, trade, and banking. The Medici use banking wealth to gain power and support art, architecture, libraries, schools, churches. The Renaissance grows in that environment. Some Medici rise to the papacy. Church fundraising with indulgences triggers Luther's protests, and suddenly you can move from Marco Polo to the Silk Road to Florence to the Renaissance to the Reformation. That's why I love this story. History isn't just one event, then another event, then another event like a boring list of dates you have to memorize for a test. History's more like a giant web. You pull on one thread and suddenly the whole thing starts to move. So, were the Medici good guys? Not exactly. Were they bad guys? Not exactly. They were powerful people in a complicated time. They used their wealth for beauty, learning, politics, control, reputation, and power. And in the process, they helped shape one of the most creative periods in human history. The Renaissance wasn't just about art. It wasn't just about trade or money. It was about cities and ambition and ancient books and family reputation, political power, looking back at Greece and Rome while also building something new. And that's the strange thing about history. Sometimes a rebirth begins with merchants, bankers, wool cloth, old books, political scheming, family richness, and we remember their name. This is Have to Know History. History you just have to know. Thanks for being here.